So to introduce myself, I'm Dinyasri, and I'm a PhD candidate in chemical engineering. I've been working in research for a number of years. I did start in second year in undergrad. So a lot of this, the content in this presentation is based on my own experiences and that of my peers. So hopefully that will help some of you who are just getting started in the research world. And just as a heads up, please be prepared to turn on at least just your audio for the interactive components. It won't be in front of everyone, but I think it will help with some of the activities that we're going to be doing. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm sure you've all heard this question at some point now that you're in research. So what do you research? I know for me, I often get a little bit flustered. It's just kind of like trying to gauge how much does the other person really know? What words can I use? How much will they really understand or care? So what do you research is a very big question. But why is it important for us to have a concise answer for when people do ask us that question? Well, so oftentimes researchers develop their research pitch, which is just a way for you to verbally communicate the relevance of your research within a larger societal context. So a research pitch is really your chance to briefly explain to people why they should care about what you're doing. But let's get into a little bit more specifics about why it's important for you all to have your own research pitch. And the most important one that I think should personally speak to you is because you spent a lot of time and energy on this research. So it's probably a good idea if you can explain it very concisely, just so that you can actually share what you've been doing with your time. Research pitches are very important for communicating with researchers in peripheral fields. So oftentimes you write abstracts or papers or go to conferences to communicate with researchers within your own field, but you will definitely encounter people who work on research and science that is a little bit external to exactly what you're doing. And then a research pitch is a really great way to network and connect with other researchers. Also, well, we're all within engineering, so you should definitely know commercialization is obviously a big avenue for a lot of, especially engineering research. And that's because all research does have real world applications, but especially within engineering, we often do work on a lot more application-based work. And so research pitches are absolutely essential to commercialize your work downstream, or even to highlight the potential for commercializability. And of course, this is a big one, to network with employers. So at any sort of networking event, you should be really able to communicate the kind of research that you've done within a couple of sentences and in a way that really highlights why you did it and the kind of techniques that you were using, because employers probably don't care a lot about the nitty-gritty of your research, but they will care about the overall concept of why you did what you did. And as well, so this reason for me is a lot more personal, but the reason that we often pitch our research is to really demystify research and science in general to more general audiences outside of the scientific field. We've all lived through a pandemic. We really do understand the importance of being able to convey complex information in a way that's understandable to general audiences. And this is a skill that's very much important, definitely even beyond the healthcare context, which we've seen in the pandemic. And clarifying how research is actually conducted to the general audience, is incredibly important because it makes science seem a lot less mysterious in a sense, which is very important for not just funding purposes, but for people to really understand the role of science within society. So let's dive right into the heart of the pitch. And so the most important takeaway from this workshop that I hope you will all remember and keep in mind for when you're pitching your research is you really want to convey what problem are you really trying to solve in your research. And so you really want to focus on the why more than the how, because oftentimes no one will remember how you did your research. They're not going to remember the software that you're using or the techniques or the experimental conditions. But most people will remember why you're doing something. And that's what you really want to emphasize, because that's what's going to stick in people's minds, you know? Why exactly are you doing this research, not how you're doing it. And so in a research pitch, whenever you're planning, you're brainstorming, or you're actually just doing it, you always want to start with the problem. What is the problem? And so I do want to differentiate here between what a research problem is versus a real world problem. And so a research problem is the very specific kind of research question that you would be working on for your research project. And a research problem is defined oftentimes in like very jargon technical terms. And it's very different from a real world problem. So for example, your research problem could be optimizing the efficiency of a purification process. But that's not the real world problem. The real world problem would be that we need to find a more energy efficient way to purify a certain reagent to minimize its environmental impact. That would be the real world problem. And so you want to keep in mind the difference between these two, because it really depends on the kind of audience that you're pitching to. So how you phrase your problem will be very context dependent. So let's dive right into an activity to practice this very key skill in a research pitch. So I'm going to post this link to the chat. Let me just go to the chat. So if everyone could open up this link, we're going to do just a very quick little activity, and you don't need your audio or video for this one. So if you could all, hop on that link. What I want you to do is, using one sentence, write what your research is on and why this is an important topic of study. And for this, keep in mind a non-scientific audience. So try to really focus on the why. And so I left an example. This is not my research, but this is a research that is happening within ChemEng. And so if you want to follow this format a little bit, so what you can do is actually click on these sticky notes and type in your one sentence pitch. So I will give you a few minutes to do that. And if you have questions or if you want to chat while you do this, feel free. I see people floating around the sticky. Are you able to type on it?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Oh, I see a sticky note. So I simulated a new nuclear reactor design to demonstrate its safety and effectiveness. Yeah, I like it. Very simple, straight to the point, and you get to the why really fast, which, as I emphasized, is absolutely essential in any kind of pitch. Does anyone else have any examples they want to contribute or practice with? Oh, okay. Pitch. I developed simulation tools for understanding how optical communication signals are affected by atmospheric turbulence for ground station to satellite tracking. Okay, yeah, I like that a lot. Again, there's no technical jargon, and I understand why you did it. So pitch, making the process of building software more efficient and cost effective by reducing the need for users to input duplicate information. So I do like that there is no jargon in this one. I would only suggest to maybe give like an example for maybe to give a little bit more context for what you mean by duplicate information. Okay, pitch. I am doing exploratory research into the structure and distribution of proteins within canola seeds during oil extraction. Awesome, that's great. The only suggestion I would give for this one is, why are you doing it? I think I can speculate why you would be doing this kind of research, but I would end off this sentence with, for example, maybe to reduce costs, increase efficiency, something like that. Okay, awesome. So I will go back to the presentation. And so whenever you're starting off with a pitch, this kind of activity is a really great way to get into the headspace of starting to plan out your pitch, because it really forces you to focus on the most important aspect of your research, which is the why. So let's get back to a little bit talking about audiences, because the audience that you're pitching to your research, it determines entirely the content and the performance of your pitch. And so every audience will have a completely different interest in your research. So I'll go through some of the main audiences that you'll probably encounter within your research lifetime. And so the first one is obviously fellow researchers within and outside your field. So oftentimes this audience is more interested in the kind of techniques that you used and how you extrapolated upon current research. And their big motivation is oftentimes to see what other researchers in the field are doing or outside the field. Maybe they want to collaborate with your research. Maybe they want to enhance their own research. So this first audience cares a lot more about the methodology and the how, because they're often familiar with the why, since they're likely in a similar field. If you go to investors, so their motivation is often into, for example, commercializing your product, improving efficiency, improving the economics of it. And so they would be a lot less interested in the exact science nitty-gritty, for example, and a lot more into, for example, scalability of your research, the actual, how exactly you're conducting the research would be important for them to figure out operations, for example. And then the third most important audience that you'll often encounter is friends and family. And by this, I really just mean a non-scientific general audience. And so this kind of audience will be the most interested in why you're doing your research. They wouldn't necessarily care that you're, improving upon an existing process unless you really emphasize how it could possibly help society or help their own lives. And for pitching to general audiences, the more personal you can make it, the better. Whereas for something like fellow researchers, they would be less interested in the personal aspect of your research. And I also do want to take a moment to differentiate between an elevator pitch versus a cocktail party pitch. And so the difference between this is, so an elevator pitch is something that you practice beforehand, and it would be like a 30-second spiel that you have ready to go that very concisely explains the why and the what of your research. A cocktail party pitch is a lot more different. So if you think of a cocktail party setting, it's more like a conversation. So for a cocktail party pitch, what you would instead be doing is you'd have like a framework of your research pitch, but you wouldn't go to a cocktail party and recite a script. That would sound very awkward and people probably wouldn't care to talk to you about it. Instead, what you would do at a cocktail party or with a cocktail party pitch is have a structure of what you want to talk about and tailor the content in a more conversational tone. And so this is important to practice as well, because most oftentimes you'll be informally talking about your research with people. And so you want to be able to make sure that you can adapt to different levels of knowledge that people may have. And cocktail party pitches are also very interesting because you can actually change what you're saying based on the other person's interest level and knowledge in what you're talking about. So they're more, for me personally, I do prefer cocktail party pitches because they're a lot more informal and you can learn a lot more about the other person's interests. But elevator pitches are good to have on hand for when you're talking to or employers, people in industry, and in general, just wanting to network really efficiently. So let's talk about some elements to consider when you're creating an effective pitch. So most pitches are short. That's just kind of how they are because no one wants to really sit there and listen to a 10-minute research presentation. That's more for a conference. So if you think about something like the 3-minute thesis, their whole emphasis is on distilling the main points of your research. And so in an effective research pitch, I put here cut technical jargon, but honestly, I would say just eliminate technical jargon. So in most situations, as soon as you say a word that sounds a little bit too scientific, most people's eyes just glaze over, and then you run the risk of losing them for the rest of what you're about to say. But I really do want to emphasize that you need to understand the line between using simple language and not using patronizing language. So oftentimes when you're speaking to a general audience that's non-scientific, I do understand the tendency to want to oversimplify what you're saying. And you want to be careful that you don't take on a babying tone almost with people. So you don't want to use a language or a tone that implies they don't know anything, because even if it is a general audience, they still do have a functional understanding of the world oftentimes. And so you don't want to simplify what you're saying too much, because then again, you run the risk of them not caring what you're saying because they're maybe offended that you're simplifying things a little bit too much. So you definitely, in a research pitch, always want to stick to the main points. And what I mean by this is when you're researching, there's often several different things within your research problem that you're investigating. But when you're pitching to someone, they're not going to care about all the little side aspects to your project because they're not going to remember it and it's going to confuse your main message. So I would often stick to what's the one main thing you're investigating. So let's say you're optimizing a software for a certain context. You know, there's maybe 10 different aspects of the software that you're optimizing, but all of those aspects aren't going to be super important and it's going to take away from your main message. So I would stick to maybe the one main aspect of the software that I'm trying to optimize. And that's what I would really tell people. Always be careful when you're using statistics. So when you say numbers, you can confuse people, first of all, but also most general audiences don't have the best understanding of statistics. It's just a limitation you have to keep in mind. So when you do say statistics, unless they're just really simple numbers, like the percentage of people who get an infection every year. Too many statistics can just confuse people because they might not really understand the full context behind what you're saying. So again, just be very careful not to say too many numbers. So definitely keep in mind, stories stick longer in people's minds than facts. This is just a very key point to keep in mind when communicating complex knowledge, but you'll probably notice that when you remember information, there's always a lot of context behind it. So people rarely remember like course content just because it's a lot of conceptual and theoretical information. But when you link that information to a story, people are going to remember it. So for example, I could sit here and list a bunch of statistics on the number and type of infections people get per year, but you're not going to remember that. But instead, if I started with a story of a chronic infection that someone in Canada was living with as the motivation behind my research, you'll probably remember that story. So another important thing to keep in mind for your pitch is you want to really consider the novelty of your research. And so what this really means is, so this really relates back to the audience. So you always want to keep the audience that you're pitching in your mind. And so so when you're, for example, pitching to other researchers, the kind of novelty about your research that you want to explain is how and why are you expanding on previous research? So are you optimizing an existing method within the field? Are you exploring a new theoretical concept in an experimental way? So this is what other researchers would mostly be interested in. What new thing are you doing within science? If you're talking to investors, they're not going to really care how novel your research is unless you put it in the context of comparing it with current standards. Because to an investor, what they would really care about is how different is your method from existing, how different is your research from the existing research and the existing ways that we do things? And is what you're proposing better? So is it more efficient? Is it more economical? So you could have the most novel technology in the world that you're developing, but if it's really expensive, an investor really won't care about the novelty. If you're pitching to general audiences, oftentimes you really don't have to explain the novelty, because to explain the novelty of your research, if you have to go into a lot of very specific context and technical jargon, then it doesn't matter. For general audiences, my rule of thumb is oftentimes just to zoom out a lot and only focus on the big picture. So you don't really have to say why your method is so much more novel than other existing methods within the research field. You pretty much have to say, why are you working on this problem? And that's enough for most general audiences. So I do have an example of an effective pitch. So this is from the 3-minute thesis from Waterloo in their engineering department. So I'll play this for you guys, then we can talk about some of the information in it. And please let me know if you can't hear the audio.
You can't run from it. You can't hide from it. It's coming. Summer road construction. Nothing can ruin the excitement of a family vacation or a road trip with friends like construction. I don't know about you, but I hate construction. Okay, let's say it in a different way. I don't hate construction if it doesn't get in my way. I hate having to take detours or drive slower. I know the cracks on the pavement need to be fixed, as they directly affect riding comfort and cause safety issues, because cracks lead to potholes, which can cause accidents or damage your car. So why can't those cracks just heal themselves? Why can't we build roads to last longer? And here is where my research will contribute. I am working on developing a self-healing pavement. This innovative idea is inspired by the human body, specifically its ability to adapt, evolve, and heal itself. My research will leverage different strategies to create a range of high-performance asphalt mixes. I will explore the use of self-healing materials, nanomaterials, and phase change materials. The most interesting one, in my opinion, is the phase change materials, as these materials have the capability to store and release large amounts of energy as temperature goes up or down, which can be very useful for Canadian weather. Adding these materials to asphalt mixes will be effective when the crack is in its micro size, when it's smaller than we can see. As shown in the healing process picture, these materials act as bandages that will hold the two sides of the crack together, arresting further degradation and making the healing process faster. This connection will prevent cracks from forming, but if one does start, to help these micro cracks heal themselves. The incredible part of this process that it can be done several times during the service life of the road. Ultimately, this research aims to contribute to the construction of a highly durable and long-lasting pavement in Canada and in the world. Maybe we can't run from construction, but at least we can delay it. Thank you.
Hopefully you heard that well enough. And so I do want to go through some of the things that you might have noticed in the video, and I'm going to break it down in terms of the key elements that I noticed and that are pretty prevalent among all research pitches. So this one is a little bit more optional and depends on the context, but oftentimes you do want to introduce yourself at the beginning of a research pitch, not just because it's a normal thing to do in social interactions, but because sometimes you do want to emphasize why you are the expert to be talking about this topic. So if you're talking to a general audience, maybe you want to mention that you are a researcher who works in this field so that there's a little bit more credibility behind what you're saying. So if you noticed in her video, she used a hook. And a hook is often a statistic or a story that is compelling. So in her case, she talked about, summer's around the road and summer means construction and we all hate construction. So this is just a really simple way to connect to a personal experience that most people have and immediately draws your attention in. After the hook, if you noticed, she mentioned the problem. So she mentioned cracks in the pavement, caused potholes, which can cause accidents and infrastructure damage. And so this is the real world context behind why she's doing what she's doing. And then she dove right into the solution, which is her main research topic. And so for her case, she talked about self-healing pavement and how it can heal small cracks, and how the novelty of that research is that the self-healing pavement can be used for a long period of time and withstand a lot of different cracks. And so if you notice, she didn't go into the exact kind of material that she used, the kind of techniques that she used, none of that, because that would have been way too complicated for this situation. But she was still able to convey some of the novelty behind what she's doing. And then, why is this important? The real world applications. She mentioned that right at the end, but also definitely throughout. And so these 5 things are really the key elements of a pitch. And so whenever you are planning your pitch, keep these in mind, because these 5 elements will essentially form the framework for how you're going to build your research pitch and your main information that you want to convey to people.